On November 14, 1979, Glenn Hobart completed his final topographic survey of Section 31, Township 42 North, in the Wind River Basin of Wyoming. He radioed base camp at 4:47 p.m. to report favorable weather conditions and an estimated return time of 6:30. At 6:31, his truck was found idling at the edge of a drainage culvert, driver's door open, coffee thermos still warm on the dashboard. The Bureau of Land Management ruled it exposure, combined with disorientation. Case closed in 11 days. But they never explained why a man who had mapped 17,000 square miles of wilderness over 23 years would walk away from his vehicle into terrain he knew better than his own reflection, or why his survey notes from that final day contained coordinates for a location that, according to every official map, did not exist. Ruth Vega had spent 11 years in the Federal Records Annex in Denver, cross-referencing cartographic discrepancies for the Government Accountability Office. Most of her work involved clerical errors, a misplaced decimal, a transposed coordinate, the ordinary failures of human attention. The Hobart file arrived on her desk in March of 1980, flagged by a postal inspector who had noticed something odd. 14 registered letters sent by Hobart over 6 months, all addressed to the same post office box in Thermopolis, all returned as undeliverable. The box existed. The addressee did not. Vega pulled the survey records for Section 31 and found what the postal inspector had missed. Hobart's final coordinates matched a claim boundary that had been filed, approved, and then erased from the county register 3 weeks after his disappearance. The Thermopolis post office occupied a brick building on Broadway Street that had been painted and repainted so many times the corners had lost their edges. Vega arrived on a Tuesday morning, carrying photocopies of Hobart's returned letters in a government-issue briefcase. The postmaster was a thin man named Dale Fenwick, who had held the position for 19 years. He studied the letters with the careful attention of someone who understood that mail delivery was a matter of public trust.
Box 441. That's the Mineral Development Corporation. Been renting that box since '76.
The letters came back marked, "No such addressee."
That's correct. They were addressed to a Mr. Warren Slade. No such person is authorized to receive mail at that box.
Who is authorized?
That would be confidential information, ma'am. Postal regulations.
Vega drove 40 miles east to the Hot Springs County Courthouse, where the land records were kept in a basement that smelled of mildew and old paper. The clerk, a heavy-set woman named Marge Lindquist, found the original claim for Section 31 in a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in months. The dust on the folder was undisturbed.
Mineral Development Corporation. Filed a prospecting claim in July of '77. Standard boilerplate. Uranium exploration. The claim was withdrawn? Withdrawn and expunged. November 28th, '79. 2 weeks after your surveyor went missing. Who signed the withdrawal? County Assessor, Roy Tibbetts. He retired last spring. Moved to Arizona, I think, or New Mexico, somewhere warm.
Vega noted the date. 2 weeks after Hobart's disappearance. 2 days before the BLM closed the case. The Mineral Development Corporation had been incorporated in Delaware in 1974, with a registered agent in Wilmington who specialized in anonymous shell companies. The Wyoming Secretary of State's office provided a list of officers, 3 names, all with addresses that trace back to the same law firm in Casper. Vega recognized the firm. Hadley, Pruitt and Associates had represented energy interests in half the mineral disputes in the state for the past decade. She requested the corporate filing documents and was told they would take 6 to 8 weeks to retrieve from storage. When she asked to expedite the request, the clerk informed her that the relevant files had been misfiled during a recent office reorganization. They were working to locate them. Vega found Glenn Hobart's widow living in a single-story house on the outskirts of Riverton. Dorothy Hobart was 61 years old, with hands that showed 40 years of ranch work and eyes that had stopped expecting good news. She invited Vega inside without asking for identification.
The government people came twice. Once to tell me Glenn was missing, once to tell me they'd stopped looking. They were very polite about it.
I'm investigating a discrepancy in your husband's survey records, Mrs. Hobart.
A discrepancy.
His final coordinates don't appear on any official map.
Glenn mapped places that didn't want to be mapped. That was his job.
Did he mention anything unusual in the weeks before his disappearance?
He mentioned he might have made a mistake. Said it was too late to fix it.
Dorothy Hobart led Vega to a small room at the back of the house that had served as her husband's home office. A drafting table dominated one wall, covered with a topographic map of the Wind River Basin. Coffee ring stains marked the corners where cups had been set down and forgotten. A parallel ruler lay across the map at an angle that suggested interrupted work.
I haven't touched anything. The BLM took his work files, but they left the personal ones. Said they weren't relevant.
May I look through them?
You can have them. I don't want them anymore.
The files contained 23 years of survey notes, personal correspondence, and photographs of terrain features. Buried near the bottom was a manila envelope marked MDC, Do Not File. Inside were carbon copies of the 14 letters that had been returned from Thermopolis, along with a hand-drawn map that matched no official survey Vega had ever seen. The hand-drawn map showed a rectangular area approximately 4 miles long and 2 miles wide, oriented northeast to southwest. The boundaries were marked with precise coordinates that corresponded to Hobart's final survey notes. Within the rectangle, Hobart had drawn a series of symbols that Vega did not recognize. Small circles with crosses through them, arranged in a grid pattern. In the margin, he had written a single word: overburden. Vega knew the term from her years of reviewing mining claims. Overburden was the rock and soil that had to be removed to access valuable mineral deposits beneath. But the map showed no mining operation. No roads, no structures, no evidence of development. Just empty land and those strange symbols repeated 47 times across the terrain. Vega drove to the coordinates on Hobart's map the following morning. The terrain was unremarkable. Rolling sagebrush hills cut by seasonal drainages, the kind of landscape that covered millions of acres in central Wyoming. She parked where Hobart's truck had been found and walked the perimeter of the rectangular area, looking for any sign of the symbols he had drawn. After 3 hours, she found the first one, a rusted metal stake driven into the ground, almost invisible among the sage. The stake was stamped with a serial number and the letters AEC, Atomic Energy Commission. Vega had seen those letters before, in files that crossed her desk with increasing frequency. Uranium prospecting claims from the 1950s, when the government was buying yellow cake at premium prices for the weapons program. Most of those claims had been abandoned decades ago. This one, apparently, had not. Vega found 17 stakes in total, each marked with the same AEC designation and sequential serial numbers. The grid pattern matched Hobart's map exactly. Whatever he had been documenting, it was real. Back in Denver, she pulled the Atomic Energy Commission's historical records for Hot Springs County and found nothing. No claims filed, no surveys conducted, no permits issued. The stakes existed. The paperwork did not. She called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which had absorbed the AEC's functions in 1975, and was transferred 4 times before reaching a clerk who told her that certain historical records had been reclassified during the transition. She would need to file a Freedom of Information request. The estimated response time was 18 to 24 months.
These stakes have AEC serial numbers. Someone filed a claim.
Mom, if there's no record, there's no claim. That's how records work.
The law firm of Hadley, Pruitt & Associates occupied the top floor of a 6-story building in downtown Casper. Vega arrived without an appointment and was kept waiting for 45 minutes in a reception area decorated with oil paintings of Wyoming landscapes. When a secretary finally escorted her to a conference room, She was met by a man in his 50s with thinning hair and an expression of practiced patience. His name, according to the brass plate on the door, was Carl Hadley.
Miss Vega, I understand you've been making inquiries about one of our corporate clients.
The Mineral Development Corporation.
A legitimate business entity, fully compliant with state and federal regulations.
With officers who share your mailing address.
We provide registered agent services. It's a common arrangement.
Who owns the corporation, Mr. Hadley?
Ownership is a matter of public record, Miss Vega. You're welcome to review the corporate filings.
The corporate filings have been misfiled, according to the Secretary of State's office.
Administrative errors happen. I'm sure they'll turn up.
A surveyor named Glenn Hobart sent 14 registered letters to your client. They were all returned.
I'm not aware of any correspondence from Mr. Hobart.
He disappeared 3 days after the last letter was returned.
I read about that. A tragedy. The wilderness can be unforgiving.
Hadley's face revealed nothing. He had the practiced calm of a man who had answered difficult questions for powerful clients his entire career. But his hands, Vega noticed, were pressed flat against the conference table. He was holding himself very still. Vega returned to Denver and began mapping the connections. The Mineral Development Corporation, the Hadley firm, the missing corporate filings, the erased land claim, the AEC stakes that existed without paperwork, the retired county assessor who had signed the withdrawal and then moved to Arizona. Each thread led to another thread, and every thread eventually disappeared into a gap in the records. Someone had been very careful, but Hobart had been careful too. His letters to Warren Slade, whoever that was, had been sent by registered mail. That meant signatures. Vega pulled the postal receipts and found that all 14 letters had been signed for by the same person. The signature was illegible, but the printed name beneath it was not. R. Tibbetts. The county assessor had been receiving Hobart's letters and returning them unopened. Roy Tibbetts had not moved to Arizona. He had moved to Tucson, which was close enough for government purposes, but far enough to make a casual visit inconvenient. Vega filed a travel authorization request and was denied. Budget constraints, her supervisor explained. The GAO was not in the business of investigating old missing persons cases. Vega pointed out that she was investigating a cartographic discrepancy, which was exactly the business the GAO was in. Her supervisor suggested she focus on more productive uses of her time.
Hobart's dead, Vega. The BLM closed the case. There's nothing here but paperwork errors.
Paperwork errors don't erase land claims.
People make mistakes. Files get lost. That's not a conspiracy. That's bureaucracy.
Someone signed for his letters and sent them back unopened.
That's a postal matter, not our jurisdiction.
Vega used 3 days of accumulated leave and bought a plane ticket to Tucson with her own money. Roy Tibbetts lived in a retirement community on the outskirts of the city, in a stucco house with a small yard full of decorative gravel. He was 73 years old, with the careful movements of someone managing a chronic condition. He did not seem surprised to see her.
You're the one from Denver, the records lady.
You know who I am?
Carl Hadley called me last week. Said someone was asking questions about the old Hobart business.
What did he tell you to say?
He told me not to say anything, but I'm too old to take orders from lawyers.
Then tell me about the land claim you erased.
I didn't erase anything. I signed what they put in front of me. That's all I ever did. They came to me in '77. Said they needed a claim processed quickly. Mineral exploration, uranium deposits. Big money for the county if it panned out.
Who came to you?
Hadley. And another man. Never got his name. Wore a government suit, had government manners. Said the claim was part of a federal energy initiative.
Was it?
I didn't ask. I just filed the paperwork.
And when Hobart started sending letters?
Hadley told me to sign for them and send them back. Said Hobart was interfering with a sensitive project. Said it would all be sorted out.
But Hobart didn't stop.
No. He kept mapping, kept writing. Then he disappeared, and Hadley told me to sign the withdrawal. Said the project was over.
What project, Mr. Tibbets?
I don't know. I never knew. I just did what they asked because they said it was important. Because they paid me $500 every time I signed something. That was a month's salary, Miss Vega. I had a daughter in college.
You took bribes to process fraudulent claims.
I took money to not ask questions. There's a difference.
Not legally.
I know. I've known for 3 years. Every time I see a story about Glenn Hobart's widow, I know.
Tibbets reached into the drawer of his side table and pulled out a manila envelope. It was yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had turned brittle.
Hobart's last letter, the one I was supposed to return. I kept it instead. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someone would come asking eventually.
The envelope contained 6 pages of single-spaced typescript. Hobart had written a detailed account of what he had found at Section 31. A grid of 47 core sample sites, drilled in the 1950s as part of the AEC's uranium prospecting program. The sites had been surveyed, sampled, and then abandoned when the ore grade proved too low for economical extraction. The records had been classified and eventually lost in the transition between federal agencies. But the land itself remained, and in 1977, someone had realized that the old survey data could be used to file fraudulent mineral claims. The claims would never be developed. They didn't need to be. They only needed to exist long enough to be sold to investors who believed they were buying into the next uranium boom. Hobart had documented everything. The original AEC stake locations, the new claim boundaries filed by the Mineral Development Corporation, the discrepancies between the official survey records and what actually existed on the ground. He had calculated that the fraudulent claims encompassed approximately 12,000 acres of federal land, with an estimated investment value of $6 million. The investors, he wrote, were being sold shares in mineral deposits that did not exist, using survey data that had been selectively edited to remove any reference to the failed 1950s exploration. The scheme required only 3 things: access to the classified AEC records, a cooperative county assessor, and the elimination of anyone who noticed the discrepancies. Hobart had noticed. And then Hobart had disappeared. Vega flew back to Denver and began the work of verification. The Securities and Exchange Commission had no record of the Mineral Development Corporation offering shares to investors. The Wyoming State Geologist's Office had no record of any uranium exploration in Section 31 since 1958. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Freedom of Information Office informed her that her request was still being processed and would she please stop calling. But the postal records confirmed that Hobart had sent his letters. The county records confirmed that someone had filed and then erased a land claim. And Tibbets, whatever his crimes, had given her the letter that proved Hobart knew what was happening. The question was, who else knew? And who had decided that Hobart's knowledge was worth more than his life? The man in the government suit. Tibbets had mentioned him once, then refused to elaborate. Vega pulled the visitor logs from the Hot Springs County Courthouse for July 1977, when the original claim had been filed. The logs showed 17 visitors that month, most of them local residents with routine business. But on July 14th, the day the Mineral Development Corporation's claim was recorded, the log showed a visitor who had signed in as W. Slade, BLM. Warren Slade, the name on Hobart's returned letters, the addressee who did not exist. Vega called the Bureau of Land Management's personnel office and asked for employment records for anyone named Slade who had worked in Wyoming in the 1970s. The clerk told her there was no one by that name in their files. Never had been.
Are you certain?
Mom, I've been doing this for 20 years. Warren Slade never worked for the BLM.
A name that didn't exist. An address that couldn't receive mail. a visitor who signed into a county courthouse claiming credentials he didn't have. Vega was beginning to understand the shape of the thing, even if she couldn't see all its edges. Someone with access to classified federal records had partnered with a local law firm to create fraudulent mineral claims. They had used a county assessor as their point of contact and invented a fictitious government employee as a front. When a surveyor noticed the discrepancies and started asking questions, they had intercepted his correspondence and waited for the problem to solve itself. But Hobart hadn't stopped. He had kept mapping, kept writing, kept documenting, until one November afternoon he drove to Section 31 and never came back. Vega needed to find Warren Slade, or whoever was using that name. She started with the obvious sources: driver's license records, social security files, voter registration rolls. Nothing in Wyoming. Nothing in Colorado. Nothing in any of the surrounding states. She expanded the search to include anyone who had worked on uranium exploration projects in the 1950s and later moved into private industry. The list was long, but most of the names were accounted for: retired, deceased, or still working in identifiable positions. One name, however, stood out: Walter Stedman, former AEC geologist. Last known employer, Department of Energy, Denver Regional Office. Current status, retired, 1978. Forwarding address, none provided. Walter Stedman had spent 31 years with the federal government, first with the Atomic Energy Commission and then with its successor agencies. His personnel file showed a career of steady advancement: field geologist, regional supervisor, program director. His security clearance had been upgraded 3 times. His last assignment, before retirement, had been overseeing the declassification of historical survey records in the Rocky Mountain region. He had access, he had knowledge, and he had disappeared from government records exactly 18 months before Glenn Hobart started sending his letters. Vega drove to the Department of Energy's regional office in Denver and asked to speak with anyone who had worked with Walter Stedman. The receptionist directed her to a conference room where she waited for 30 minutes before a man in his 60s entered and introduced himself as Harold Pruitt. The name was familiar: Hadley Pruitt and Associates. She was sitting across from the brother of the lawyer who had been representing the Mineral Development Corporation.
Miss Vega, I understand you're interested in one of our former employees.
Walter Stedman.
Walt retired 2 years ago. Health reasons, I believe.
Do you have a forwarding address?
I'm afraid that information is confidential.
Mr. Pruitt, your brother represents a company that filed fraudulent mineral claims using classified government data. A federal surveyor is dead. I'm going to need that address.
I don't know anything about fraudulent claims, and my brother's business is his own.
Your brother's business is representing a shell company that was created to sell worthless mineral rights to investors. The company used government survey data that only someone with your clearance level could access.
That's a serious accusation.
It's a serious crime.
Pruitt's face remained impassive, but Vega noticed his hands moving beneath the table. He was reaching for something. When he brought his hands back up, he was holding a business card.
If you have questions about federal employees or federal records, I suggest you contact the Inspector General's office. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your concerns.
I'm sure they will.
The card was blank except for a phone number. A message. She understood. Vega called the number from a payphone outside the DOE building. It rang 4 times before a recorded message answered. You have reached a non-working number. Please check the listing and try again. She hung up and stood in the phone booth, watching the traffic pass on Colfax Avenue. Someone was watching her. She could feel it, the way Hobart must have felt it in those final weeks, when he was mapping terrain that didn't want to be mapped. She drove back to her apartment and found her door unlocked. The lock hadn't been forced. Someone had a key. Inside, her files were exactly where she had left them, except for one thing: The manila envelope from Tibbetts was gone. Hobart's letter, the only physical evidence that connected the conspiracy to a specific crime, had vanished. Vega reported the break-in to the Denver police, who took her statement and promised to investigate. She reported the missing evidence to her supervisor, who told her that without documentation, there was no case. She reported the connection between Harold Pruitt and his brother's law firm to the GAO's ethics office, who told her they would look into it. She received a letter from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission informing her that her Freedom of Information request had been denied due to national security concerns. She received a letter from the Wyoming Secretary of State's office informing her that the Mineral Development Corporation's files had been located and were available for review. When she drove to Cheyenne to examine them, she found that the files contained only the articles of incorporation. All other documents had been removed for routine archival processing. The walls were closing in. Every door she opened led to another door that was locked. Every person she contacted either knew nothing or knew too much to talk. Vega understood, finally, why Hobart had kept sending letters to an address that returned them unopened. He wasn't trying to communicate. He was trying to create a record. A paper trail that couldn't be erased because it existed in the postal system, not in any government file. She began doing the same thing. Registered letters to herself, documenting everything she had found. Copies of the copies, sent to a post office box she had rented under her mother's maiden name. If something happened to her, the letters would keep arriving. The record would persist. 3 weeks after the break-in, Vega received a phone call at her office. The caller identified himself as Glenn Hobart. She knew it wasn't possible. She knew it was a threat. But she agreed to meet him anyway at a diner in Golden, 30 miles from Denver. The man who sat down across from her was not Glenn Hobart. He was Walter Stedman. She recognized him from the personnel file photograph. The same receding hairline, the same government-issue glasses, aged by 2 years and something else that Vega couldn't name.
You've been asking a lot of questions, Miss Vega.
You've been answering them in your own way.
I didn't kill Glenn Hobart.
I want you to know that.
Then who did?
Nobody.
Glenn Hobart isn't dead.
Glenn figured it out before I did.
The whole scheme. Hadley, Pruitt, the shell company, the investors. He knew that if he went public, they'd discredit him, make him look like a disgruntled employee with a grudge. So he decided to disappear instead.
He staged his own death?
He staged his own absence.
Left enough evidence to make it look suspicious, then walked away. He's been living in Canada for the past 5 months, waiting for someone to pick up the thread.
Why didn't he go to the authorities?
Because the authorities are part of it.
Harold Pruitt isn't just a bureaucrat. He's the one who gave me access to the classified records, told me it was a legitimate declassification project. By the time I realized what I was really doing, it was too late.
You helped them.
I helped them. And now I'm trying to undo it.
Why are you telling me this?
Because Glenn asked me to.
He's been following your investigation from the beginning. The letters you've been sending yourself? He knows about those. He knows about everything.
How?
Because I've been feeding him information. And because you're not as invisible as you think you are.
Stedman slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Vega opened it and found a hand-drawn map, similar to the one she had seen in Hobart's files. But this map showed something different. Not the grid of AEC stakes, but a series of routes. Roads, airstrips, border crossings. A path from Wyoming to Saskatchewan.
Glenn wants to come back.
He wants to testify, but he needs documentation that he can't provide himself. He needs the records you've been collecting.
Vega studied the map for a long moment. The routes made sense. A man who knew the terrain, who had spent his career mapping empty spaces, would know how to move through them without being seen. But something didn't add up.
If Hobart's alive, why hasn't he contacted his wife? She's been grieving for 5 months.
He has contacted her.
She knows he's alive. She's been covering for him this whole time.
She told me she had no idea what happened to him.
She told you what Glenn asked her to tell you.
Until he knew he could trust you.
And does he trust me now?
He trusts you enough to send me.
The question is whether you trust him.
Vega folded the map and put it in her pocket. She didn't trust anyone. But she believed Stedman was telling the truth, or at least a version of it. Vega drove back to Riverton the following weekend. Dorothy Hobart met her at the door with the same calm expression she had worn during their first meeting. This time, Vega understood what that calm meant. Not grief, but vigilance.
You've known all along.
I've known since the day he left. He called me from a phone booth in Billings and told me what he was doing.
You lied to the BLM. You lied to me.
I protected my husband. That's what wives do.
Do you know where he is now?
I know how to reach him. That's not the same thing.
I need to talk to him. Not through Stedman, directly.
He said you'd say that. He also said you should look at the original survey notes more carefully. There's something you missed.
Vega returned to the drafting table in Hobart's home office and spread out the topographic maps she had examined months before. The coffee stains were still there, the parallel ruler still angled across the paper. But this time she looked at the margins, where Hobart had made small notations in pencil. Numbers that she had assumed were elevation markers. Coordinates that she had assumed were reference points. She traced them with her finger and realized they weren't random. They were a sequence, a code. When she plotted the coordinates on a separate map, they formed a pattern. Not a grid, but a name. Pruitt. Glenn Hobart had hidden the answer in plain sight, in the margins of his own survey notes, where anyone who knew how to read a map would eventually find it. Vega sat in her car outside the Hobart house and put the pieces together aloud, the way she had learned to do when a case finally made sense.
Harold Pruitt is the key. He had access to the classified AEC records through his position at the Department of Energy. He gave those records to his brother Carl, who used them to create the Mineral Development Corporation. They recruited Walter Stedman to provide technical expertise and Roy Tibbets to process the paperwork. The scheme was simple. File fraudulent mineral claims on worthless land, then sell shares to investors who believed they were buying into the next uranium boom. Hobart noticed the discrepancies during routine survey work and started documenting what he found. When they couldn't silence him through the usual channels, they decided to let him disappear. But Hobart was smarter than they thought. He staged his own absence and left a trail for someone else to follow. Someone like me.
Vega drove back to Denver and typed up a complete report. The fraudulent claims, the classified records, the bribery of a county official, the obstruction of a federal investigation. She named Harold Pruitt, Carl Hadley, Walter Stedman, and Roy Tibbets. She attached copies of every document she had collected, every letter she had sent to herself, every piece of evidence that hadn't been stolen or destroyed. Then she made 3 copies, one for the FBI, one for the Securities and Exchange Commission, one for a reporter at the Denver Post who had covered energy industry scandals before. She mailed all 3 on the same day, by registered mail, with delivery confirmation required. If anyone tried to intercept them, there would be a record. If anyone tried to deny receiving them, there would be proof. The FBI field office called her 2 weeks later. They had questions. They had concerns. They had, it seemed, finally decided to pay attention. Vega met with 2 agents in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and institutional carpet cleaner. She told them everything she knew, everything she had documented, everything she had deduced. They listened without expression and took notes on legal pads. When she finished, the senior agent closed his notepad and leaned back in his chair.
Miss Vega, do you understand that you've been conducting an unauthorized investigation into matters that may involve national security.
I understand that I've been doing my job, which is identifying discrepancies in federal records.
Your job is reviewing paperwork, not accusing federal employees of fraud.
The fraud is in the paperwork. That's how I found it.
We'll be in touch.
The Denver Post ran the story 3 days later. Front page, above the fold. Federal employees linked to uranium fraud scheme. Harold Pruitt resigned from the Department of Energy the same morning. Carl Hadley issued a statement denying all wrongdoing and announced that he was taking an extended leave of absence. Roy Tibbetts suffered a heart attack in his Tucson retirement home and was hospitalized in critical condition. Walter Stedman disappeared again, this time for good, and Glenn Hobart remained in Canada, waiting for a guarantee of immunity that might never come. The scheme had been exposed, the conspirators had been named, but the money had already changed hands, the investors had already lost their savings, and the empty land in Section 31 remained exactly as it had always been, unmapped, unclaimed, and indifferent to the crimes committed in its name. Vega drove to Section 31 one last time in the spring of 1981. The sagebrush had turned green with the season, and the Wind River Range still held snow on its highest peaks. She parked where Hobart's truck had been found and walked the perimeter of the rectangular area he had mapped. The AEC stakes were still there, rusted and forgotten, marking the boundaries of a claim that had never been legitimate. In the distance, a meadowlark sang from a fence post. Vega stood in the empty landscape and understood, finally, what Hobart had been trying to document. Not just the fraud, but the erasure. The way that certain places, certain people, certain crimes could be made to disappear from the official record while still existing in the world. She had pulled this one back into the light. But there were others out there, buried in filing cabinets and classified archives, waiting for someone to notice the discrepancies. She got back in her car and drove toward Denver, where the paperwork was waiting.